Hello there and welcome to my painting guide for the Star Wars Shatterpoint Fearless and Inventive Squad Pack. I hope you find it useful. It is a really fun set to paint. As you can see, I sprayed up Luke black and everyone else was sprayed white. I'll start with Luke. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that I cover up any areas that I missed with the spray with some Abaddon black. For the first major highlight, I'll be using Corvus black. I'll then add some more highlights using Corvus black mixed with Eshin grey, about a 50-50 mix. And finally, Eshin grey just by itself on the very edges and tips. With Luke now mostly out of the way, I'm going to move on to Leia and Lando, and I'm going to use Mornfang brown to start painting in the mid-tone leather. If you're unsure where to paint, just use the box art or find a picture on the internet to use that as a guide. I'll then use a mix of Lamia Medium and Agrax Earth Shade, about 50-50 mix, to start shading in all the areas we've just painted. And while that dries, I'll start painting in some Bugman's Glow on Luke's flesh, which will be given a shade of Reichland Flesh Shade. R2 is going to get a mix of Basil Canum Grey with some contrast paint. This is going to be painted quite liberally over every area that's eventually going to be white. With that out of the way and drying, we'll move back to Lando and Leia. I'm going to use Mornfang Brown mixed with some Scrag Brown, about 50-50 mix, to start putting in the first highlight. Followed by Scrag Brown just by itself. Followed by a 50-50 mix of Scrag Brown and Tau Light Ochre as the final highlight. Next, for Lando, I'm going to use some Rakarth Flesh to paint in his trousers. And the lighter leather on Leia is going to get a coat of Tau Light Ochre. Both of these will then receive a wash of Army Painter Soft Tone mixed with some Lamia Medium. While that dries, we'll continue work on Luke, and I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow just to neaten up all the areas that we've previously washed. I'll then use a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone to start painting in all the details. Before I get too far into the face though, I want to sort out his eyes, so I'm going to use Abaddon Black to paint the recess, followed by a thin line of matte white. And then finally, Abaddon Black again to mark out the pupil. With that out of the way, I'm going to go back to painting his flesh. I'm just going to use Cadian Flesh Tone now for the bulk of the colour. This will be followed up by adding Cadian Flesh and Kislev Flesh together to start painting in the highlights. Followed by Kislev Flesh just on its own to do the very tips and peaks of the skin. That's given plenty of time for the washes to dry, so I'm going to go back to Lando and I'm going to use some Rakarth Flesh to start highlighting his trousers. I'll then mix in some Pallid Witch Flesh to the Rakarth Flesh, about 50-50 to do the next highlight. Followed by Pallid Witch Flesh just on the very edges of those creases. I'm going to go back to Leia and use Tau Light Ochre once again to smarten up and tidy up everywhere we've just washed. And then I'm going to do a 70-30 mix of Tau Light Ochre and Ushabti Bone to start the main layer. Followed by adding in a little bit more Ushabti Bone, so it's about a 50-50 mix to start the first set of highlights. I'll add even more Ushabti Bone to the mix, so we've got about a 10-90 split between Ushabti Bone and Tau Light Ochre. And for that final highlight, it's just going to be Ushabti Bone all by itself. Now I'm going to start work on the darker leather, so I'm going to use Dryad Bark to coat all those areas. I did that for both Leia and Lando. Both of them then received a wash of Agrax Earthshade mixed with some Lamia Medium. While that dries, we're going to start working on R2, and I'm going to start using some grey cere to mark in all the areas that are going to remain white. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of grey cere and matte white. And then finally it'll be matte white just by itself. Now you want to do at least a couple of layers of this because matte white is quite thin and you don't want to have your paints all lumpy. So do a couple of thin coats and it'll come out nice and crisp. I then moved back to Lando and Leia and started on their leather. Starting with the harder parts, I used Dryad Bark, about a 70-30 mix with Gothor Brown. This was used on Lando's armor plates, the darker parts of his helmet, and it was used for Leia's helmet. Then a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothor Brown to do the first highlight. Then a 30-70 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothor Brown for the next highlight. And then finally Gothor Brown just on the very tips on edges for Leia's helmet. Next up is the straps and the loincloth that Lando has, as well as the straps on Leia. That's a 70-30 mix of Dryad Bark and Rakarth Flesh. Next is a 50-50 mix of Rakarth Flesh and Dryad Bark, just for the first edge highlight. And then a 10-90 mix of Dryad Bark and Rakarth Flesh for the final edge highlight. Lando's leather is now out of the way, so it's just layers left to do. For the final part of Leia, I've used a mix of Dryad Bark and Tau Light Ochre, about 10% Tau Light Ochre and 90% Dryad Bark. I'm going to continue to lighten this mix with Tau Light Ochre, so now it's about 70-30 Dryad Bark, Tau Light Ochre. Then 50-50 of Tau Light Ochre and Dryad Bark. This was painted on with more of a stippling effect rather than just using normal techniques. Then I continue to add Tau Light Ochre to the mix, so we've got a 10% Dryad Bark and 90% Tau Light Ochre. This was also stippled on as well. And lastly, Tau Light Ochre just by itself was stippled onto the corners and peaks. Next we're going to paint Lando's flesh. Now if, like me, you foolishly glued his mask to his helmet before you painted it, just use the utmost care when painting the Catachan flesh onto the model. That was then given a wash with Reichel and Flesh Shade. And the beak of Leia's helmet was painted with Tau Light Ochre. This was followed up by a wash of Agrax Earthshade. I don't have the footage of that for some reason. That video file was a little bit corrupted when I put it into the editor. After the wash on Lando's skin had dried, I mixed some Catachan flesh with Blood Reaver flesh, about 50-50 mix to start the first highlight, and then Blood Reaver flesh just by itself for the second. Lando's mask was then given a coat of Zandari dust, but just on the bone areas. There's a tiny little bit of leather as well holding it all together, so that was painted with rat skin flesh. And it was all given a wash with some Army Painter's soft tone. With that drying, we went back to Leia and painted the beak on her helmet with some Tau Light Ochre just to tidy things up a little bit. And then I mixed in a tiny little bit of Wraithbone for a 50-50 highlight for the one and only highlight we're going to do. After Lando's face mask is dried, we're going to use some Zandari dust again just to highlight the mask. But for the tusks, we're going to go one step further and highlight it with some Wraithbone as well. Next, we'll get his sleeves out of the way, which we're going to start by painting Abaddon black. I'm also going to start painting any areas that need to be washed in Nuln oil as well. So that includes using Iron Warriors to paint his staff, the visor on Leia's helmet as well as her weapon, and then I'll turn to Iron Hand Steel to paint the thermal detonator in her hands, that little knobbly bit coming off her helmet, and the bullets on her belt. Luke's lightsaber will also get painted with Iron Hand Steel as well as his belt buckle, and there's a tiny little bit of metal on his belt that represents where he hooks his lightsaber. And lastly, we'll start blocking in the details for R2 as well. If you're not entirely sure where to paint, just look up a reference guide on the internet. There's plenty out there. All of those areas will then get a wash with some Nuln oil. While I wait for that to dry, I'll use Zandari dust to paint in Luke's hair, which will then receive a wash of Agrax Earthshade. All the darker metal was then given a once-over again with Iron Warriors. The silver received another coat of Iron Hand Steel, just making sure we didn't go into the recesses. Then a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormpost Silver, just to give the lighter silver an extra shine. This, of course, is mostly used on R2's dome. And then R2 himself received some Stormhost Silver for the final highlight. For the black sleeves on Lando, I used some Corvus Black to begin with, followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey. Next, I've used Warplock Bronze to paint the remaining parts of his armour, which was then given a wash of Agrax Earthshade. With Lando now out of the way, it's time to move back to R2. I've used Thousand Suns Blue to paint all the areas that are blue on R2. If you're not sure where they are, just look up some reference guides. There's plenty on the internet. All the blue was then given a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. Now, be very careful when you do this part because you don't want to mess up any of the white. While that dries, I've used Dryad Bark to paint the little tubes on his feet. And they were given a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Once the blue shade had dried, I'd moved on to Amaran Blue and I started to highlight all the areas. I then mixed matte white with the Amaran Blue, a 80-20 mix in favour of Amaran Blue, just to do the final highlight. There's a couple of bits on his legs that are metal, so I've painted them with Iron Hand Steel. I then used Abaddon Black to paint in his eye. And then I used matte white to very carefully do a couple of dots in there to represent a reflection. We're nearly finished now. It's just Luke's lightsaber to go, so that's going to be painted with Warpstone Glow. Then a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green. Then it was just Moot Green all by itself. And lastly, Moot Green mixed with some matte white, about a 80-20 mix for the final highlight. Now all the miniatures have been painted, it's time to do the bases. So we're going to do some Dawnstone Grey to paint all of the concrete areas. This is then edge highlighted with some grey sear. For the muddy / rocky areas, I've painted mine with XV88. Now you can do yours any colour you wish, but I tend to go with this because I like the sandy look. This was then edge highlighted with some Tau Light Ochre. All the bases then had Abaddon Black painted around their rims. Then some thinned down Agrax Earthshade was applied all over the bases quite liberally. Now if like me you made the huge mistake of putting a bit too much on one of the bases, just use a paintbrush to swoop that up and apply it to the other bases. And there we are, that's the Fearless and Inventive squad pack finished. Once again, Atomic Mass do a fantastic job with their miniatures. They're always fun to paint and they're always nice and crisp and clean. These guys didn't take long at all to paint, only about 6 hours in total, and it's a lot of fun to paint. If you followed this guide, I hope you found it helpful, and if you liked it, please give me a subscribe and think about giving us a thumbs up, and I'll endeavour to put some more out there. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you later. Bye for now.